Creative Entrepreneurs Blog Accounting for Success by Harish Amilineni. 0D% 0A% 0D% 0 written by %3A Harish Amilineni. 0D% 0A% 0D% 0 Who does the accounts in your business? %3F% 0D% 0A% 0D% 0A I am worried it might be you. %21 Do you have the time? %2C the aptitude. %2C the enthusiasm. %2C the acumen. %3F E2 %80 99 They got choices then. %2C haven't you? %3F either get good at it. %2C or get someone else to do it. Let me point you in the right direction. %0D% 0A% 0D% 0A Of course it goes without saying that having a good system for controlling the finances in your business is paramount. Do you know how much money you have in the bank with which to work? %3F Do you know what you owe and who owes you so you can plan your cash flow? %0D% 0A% 0D% 0 Do you understand the difference between cash flow and profitability? %3F 0D% 0A% 0D% 0 A few %E2 80 99 They made all that profit. %2C Where is it? %3F 0D% 0A% 0D% 0 Do you want to know the answers to these questions and feel the ease of control at your fingertips? %3F 0D% 0A% 0D% 0 Much has been talked about delegating this task to another. Delegating is good. %2C But abdicating is not. You will still have to work with your accountant to provide them with timely information and learn to understand what they give you back. %0D% 0A% 0D% 0 If they are not happy to teach you or gifted at translating. %E2 80 9 Accountant speak. %E2 80 9D to a language you understand. %2C Change your accountant. One way or another you must work with someone who is helpful. %2C As excited about your business as you are and a team player who deals in plain English. %0D% 0A% 0D% 0 If you care about your business being successful. %2C I urge you to make it a priority to get this first system in place. It will be enlightening and liberating. %2C in more ways than one. We can talk about other good systems as your business progresses. %0D% 0A% 0D% 0 Harish Amilineni. %0D% 0A% 0D% 0 Our client I taught to use Sage in his own businesses. Let me know how much he loves it. You could become one of those. %2C or you could be contracting with someone else who loves Sage. %28 or any other accounting package. %2C for that matter. %29 and can use it to provide really useful and exciting. %2C powerful management reports for you. %0D% 0A% 0D% 0 Knowledge is power. This knowledge applied in your business will turn it into a business to love. %2C one which provides you with more profit in less time. For more information, please follow the link below the video.